everyone, and thank you for coming.
Oh, yes, for that.
I'm Susan Burns, I'm the director of the Center for Foundation Studies, and we're delighted to welcome you to another of our Asia lectures. Took place throughout the year, and we're very delighted to have distinguished scholars of East Asian studies talking about their current research. Today, I'm delighted to introduce to all of you my dear friend David Howell, who is professor of Japanese history in the East Asian Languages and Civilizations Department at Harvard University. And I want to begin by acknowledging the profound influence David has had on my own career, albeit sometimes unintentionally. David did his undergraduate work at the University of Hawaii at Ito and his graduate work at Princeton University. He then went on to teach at the University of Texas at Austin, beginning in 1989. Now, I started my own teaching career about the same time and was desperately unhappy at the small liberal arts college where I was teaching. Luckily for me, David moved on to Princeton, opening up the job at UT Austin, subsequently hired. And I'd like to think our fates have been intertwined ever since. David also gave me the best piece of academic advice I've ever received, and I know there are a lot of graduate students in the audience, so I want to share it with you. Some years ago, I was complaining about my inability to finish my second book and relating how much I like writing articles and essays rather than books. And David told me, don't write long articles, write short books, which I think is a bit of academic wisdom for the aged. Now, David himself is a prolific author. His first book, Capitalism from Within, Economy, Society, and the State in the Japanese Fishery, was published by University of California Press in 1995. And his second book, Geography of Identity in 19th-Century Japan, was published by Princeton in 2005. In Capitalism from Within, David used the rise of the herring fish industry in Hokkaido to explore the economic transition in Japan, concluding provocatively that Tokugawa feudalism died giving birth to Meiji capitalism. In this work, as in all his work, David is deeply attentive to the human dimensions of socioeconomic change. He noted, for example, that the deculturalization of Ainu laborers began in the Tokugawa era in contract fisheries. Geography of Identity in 19th-century Japan is another work that explores, combines a big and conceptually compelling story with deep archival research, and it explores the evolution of ideas about status and ethnicity over Japan's long 19th century. Now, in addition to his scholarship, David is known for his collegiality and his contributions to the field. He's now serving as the editor of the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies and is the editor of the early modern volume of the new Cambridge History of Japan. The latter is an immense challenge, I think, getting everybody to contribute their chapters on time. It's like herding cats, to use that famous phrase. His talk today is part of a third monograph project that explores the history of human waste and garbage in the cities of Tokugawa and Meiji, Japan. So please join me in welcoming David Howell.
Thanks, Susan, so much for that very kind introduction. Collegiality, I'm going to use that. That's what I've been doing. Thanks. So I'm going to start by reading just a little bit. I think it's about 9 minutes worth of the beginning of the book manuscript, which is mostly not finished yet, but at least to prove to myself that I've been working on it, I thought I would impose it on all of you, and then I'll switch to sort of like regular talk mode after that. So just start with a little overture. Scatology does not come naturally to me. I do not tell potty jokes or regale others with the details of my morning bowel movements. I do say shit in anger or frustration from time to time, more recently than in the past, I think, but I generally strive to keep my conversations civil. And so how did I come to write a history of shit, and what do I hope to accomplish with the enterprise? And let me begin an answer to these questions by recounting the origins of this work and describing how my vision of it has changed over the years. Okay, we're back. Just forget that you saw anything else, please. Okay, So how did I come to write a history of shit, and what do I hope to accomplish with this enterprise? I first went to Japan during the late 1970s, fresh out of high school and generally ignorant of Japanese culture, history, and language. I had heard of a Japanese obsession with cleanliness, embodied in habits like taking one's shoes off when entering a house and soaking in piping hot baths at every opportunity. And yet I saw turds everywhere. Not real ones, mind you, but playful images on television and matter-of-fact treatments in children's books. During the decades since then, many of those images have made the journey to the Anglophone world. Cheerful turd emoji enliven our text messages, and Gomitaro's classic Everyone Poops has a place on the discriminating toddler's bookshelf. But at the time, they astounded me. A few years of language study later, I found myself in the stacks at a Japanese library where, seeking a few minutes diversion from whatever I'd come to do, I pulled out a volume of the venerable Meiji-era encyclopedia, Koji Ruien, and turned to kuso, the closest word to shit in Japanese. The main entry comprised 4 pages of quotations from classical Japanese prose and poetry. Later excursions to the reference room turned up many other sightings of kuso, perhaps none so arresting to me as the name of an 8th century landed estate, Put Shit Manor, Kuso Oki no Sho. That's real. So I did not look for cartoon turds and scatological references in classical texts with the expectation that these curiosities would turn into a full-fledged research project. Still, I could not help but wonder if they revealed a particular take on poop buried deep within Japanese culture that fostered the coexistence of a cult of hygiene with a no-nonsense approach to excreta. Prompted many years later by an invitation to an environmental history workshop, I recalled that wondering and set to work. Did I find a particular take on poop buried deep within Japanese culture? Well, yes and no. Nightsoil, human excrement used as a fertilizer, has a long history in Japan. Its importance as a commercial fertilizer encouraged people to consider it a thing of utility, disgusting but valuable. I suspect that the attitude continues to inform Japanese attitudes toward shit. The purveyors of adorable turd emoji may have no knowledge of shit's history as a commodity, but the parents and grandparents from whom they acquired their ideas about poop do. And although I will strive to avoid essentialism in this work, let me indulge myself here and assert something like a cultural memory of shit's utility. So yes and no. Let's think about yuckiness. Excrement smell disgusted Japanese observers no less than it did their counterparts in other parts of the world, but did not frighten them. People in the West feared shit because they thought it could sicken them. We now know, of course, that shit can sicken us, or rather we know that among the billions of microbes found in every gram of feces reside some that can make us deathly ill. But when Western observers in the 18th and 19th century recoiled from shit, they did so not from a knowledge of microbiology, but because they believed that miasmas, noxious odors, could cause illness. This belief long predated the bacteriological theory of disease causation that we all now subscribe to. Miasmas had little purchase in East Asian medical thought. Hence, Japanese observers could complain about shit's revolting odor without worrying that exposure to the smell per se might make them sick. Fearing miasmas or not reflects the evolution of medical history rather than timeless cultural essence. Others join me in thinking about shit in Japan. Economic historians write about nightsoil as a commodity produced in volume in cities like Edo and Osaka, and used as a fertilizer by farmers who grew the vegetables and fruits that fed the city's residents. Their work focuses on the peculiarities of the nightsoil trade, but tends not to dwell much on the character of shit per se. Urban historians write about the shit economy's salubrious impact on Japanese urban life, so much more hygienic than places like Paris, London, or New York. Popular writers during the last 2 or 3 decades have extrapolated from the perfect resource cycle of the excremental economy to argue for a uniquely Japanese ecological sensibility dating back to the early modern era. As Tokugawa Tsunenari, the current head of the shogunal house, puts it in a book on the legacy of the Tokugawa era, the entire population of Tokugawa Japan shared a strong interest in sanitation, with the result that no cleaner nation than Japan and no cleaner city than Edo existed in the world between 1600 and 1800. Did the early modern Japanese share a passion for sanitation? Probably not, whatever the state of Edo's streets. Green results do not necessarily reflect green intentions. The urge to see an excremental economy and environmental sensibility should not surprise us any more than my youthful urge to make cartoon turds bear the weight of deep cultural essence. Still, the sirens of essentialism sing a catchy tune. I continue to find myself enchanted by discoveries like the Japanese word for Pedera fetida, a plant whose sulfurous oils have earned it the English names skunk vine and the miasmatic Chinese fever vine. For centuries, the Japanese called it kusokazura, shit vine, but in an apparent effort to better capture its full range of stinkiness, during the Tokugawa period, they rechristened it hekusokazura, fart shit vine. As much as I would like to write a book filled only with fun scatological facts, I resolved to find another way to structure this book that I'm writing. I settled on the solution of thinking of shit not in particularly Japanese terms, but to put Japanese shit into a global context. People in early modern Japan thought of shit as a thing of utility, but so did folks in early modern China and many other places. Even in Britain, Western Europe, and the United States, experts in the 19th century looked for ways to overcome their fears and turn excrement into fertilizer and therefore cherish it. Thinking of Japanese shit in global terms opens the door to several types of insight. In this work, I will consider three in particular. First, the history of shit offers a new way to think about Japan's encounter with Western-style modernity, and indeed the material history of modernity itself. Ordinarily, we think of the middle of the 19th century as a critical dividing point. Japan's opening to diplomatic relations with the Western world in the 1850s and the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868 initiated a revolutionary wave of social, economic, and institutional changes. Schools and hospitals, trains and rickshaws, factories and steamships, leather shoes and Western haircuts made modernity evident for all to see. Yet the excremental economy of the early modern period persisted well past 1868, an infrastructural coelacanth buried behind the brick facade of the modernizing city. Its survival into the early post-World War II years reflected not Japanese underdevelopment, but the enduring value of shit as a thing of utility. Second, the relationship between the Japanese people and their shit offers us a way to think about the modern Japanese history of public health. As I've already noted, the Japanese never really subscribed to the miasmatic theory of disease causation, which lay behind, if not always obviously, many of our notions of hygiene and healthiness, and the healthiness of particular environments. The Japanese did not worry about ill winds or insalubrious odors in their interactions with their excrement. Even through their encounters with cholera, the first epidemic disease brought to their shores by modern globalization and subsequent embrace of the bacteriological theory of disease causation, Japanese during the late 19th and early 20th centuries steadfastly refused to treat excrement as the object of special anxiety. And third, the history of Japanese interactions with excrement can contribute to the literature on critical waste studies, that's a thing, which focuses, among other things, on the relationship between colonialism and the handling of waste. Scholars of critical waste studies often take imperialist denunciations of subjugated people's waste practices more or less at face value, albeit as the object of scathing critique. As I'll try to show in the book that I'm writing, the Japanese experience calls into question the very use of waste as a euphemism for human excreta. More generally, looking at non-Western attitudes toward and uses of excrement in contexts separate from formal or de facto colonial domination will enrich both the global history of shit and research on waste, water, and hygiene in the contemporary world. And at the same time, Japan's own experience as a colonial power itself, and the mimetic disgust shown by Japanese settlers in places like Seoul at practices no different from those in Tokyo, reveals the strange power of modernity. So that's sort of a preview of the book as a whole, and I will be repeating many of these themes in the rest of the talk. Here's Miffy-chan again. And I've already used naughty words several times, so sorry about that. Okay, so is excrement the answer? Two questions for any talk, at least in Japanese studies, but I suspect in many other fields of study. First, what's universal about the story? What is it about the Japanese case that speaks to people who don't have any particular interest in Japan per se? And the second question, of course, is what's Japanese about your story? isn't it just the same old, set in Japan for a change? I'm sure we've all experienced these questions coming from our dear colleagues in other fields. Maybe we even asked them. So let's finish about your story. On the one hand, if the story is too universal, it becomes a kind of see also case in the footnotes. And if it's too Japanese, then it gets relegated to a kind of human interest story, I think. There have been a few topics, all sort of abandoned by now, that I think have hit the kind of sweet spot between universality and particularity. As you can see, feudalism, Asakawa Kainichi and others found feudalism in Japan, and Japanese feudalism was a big deal for quite a while. And then sort of following out of that, modernization. During the heyday of the modernization theory in the late 50s and especially the 1960s, Japan was a place that historians and social scientists had to care about in their theorizing about the world and world history. Both of them, both feudalism and modernization, of course, have been repudiated, rightly so, I think, since then. And so one wonders, as an aspiring historian of shit, whether we in the excremental studies community can make a good case for the urgency of our own intervention. After all, on the one hand, it is about as universal a story as you can get. Everyone poops, in English and in Japanese. And at the same time, folks in Japan do seem to have a special relationship with their shit. So let's think for a few minutes about the relationship, the excremental economy in 19th century Japan. So the first thing is that the excremental economy was definitely a market economy. Today I'll mostly be talking about the city of Edo / Tokyo, or Edo, which then became Tokyo, as you all know. Osaka and other cities had variations on this, but I'll focus mostly on Tokyo. So Edo grew rapidly after its founding in 1590, and so, of course, as the city grew, more and more mouths to feed, and so it's not surprising that truck farming grew up in its hinterland. And as it turns out, human excrement, nightsoil, as a fertilizer, seems to be particularly well suited for the growing of vegetables, leafy vegetables in particular, and fruit, and things of that sort that were well suited to the urban markets in Edo. So it was actually a very good relationship between excrement as a fertilizer and the types of crops that could be grown with it. Nightsoil was not used much for rice or other grains in Japan. So you have this wonderful balance or relationship between supply and demand. And so from at least the early 18th century, probably much before that, the documentary evidence starts in earnest in the 18th century, up through the early 20th centuries, and even after, nightsoil was a very valuable commodity. Until around 1920 or so, people came into Edo or into Tokyo to buy the contents of people's latrines. If you pooped, somebody would come and pay you money to take the poop away. By about 1920, there were more people pooping in Tokyo than there were farmers who were willing to pay for it, and so there was a pretty sudden change in the dynamic, and instead of having people pay to take it away, urban dwellers had to pay somebody to come and get it. Given the nature of excrement, the switch, although it was quite shocking for poopers at the time, they quickly capitulated to the need to pay for somebody to haul away their sewage, because you just can't let it pile up too much. And nightsoil remained an important commodity, that is something that people would pay money for as a fertilizer until at least the late 1950s. But I think its use as a fertilizer survived well past that. Not so much anymore. I think there's like some niche sort of organic farmers who use it, but it's not a major commodity. So there was supply and people willing to use the supply, and then farmers in the hinterland of Edo and Tokyo also came to rely heavily on the availability of nightsoil as a commodity. And during the latter part of the Tokugawa period, starting in the late 18th century and going up all the way to the eve of the Meiji Restoration, there were periodic protests where people got upset farmers got upset about the high price of night soil, and then led protests against that. And Walthall has a classic article on the biggest of the protests in the late 18th century, but they continued right until almost like literally the eve of the shogunate's collapse in 1867. This is just a not very well done photocopy of one page of a book of about 400 pages that the Setagaya Ward Historical Museum published. That's nothing but contracts that farmers in Setagaya, which is now, of course, a very tony suburban kind of residential area in Tokyo, but at the time was a series of farming villages. Farmers in Setagaya were major consumers of Edo night soil. And as I said, the book is about 400 pages long, and it's just reproduced documents. These pages are from a survey of night soil, of the sources of night soil for farmers in Taishido village in Setagaya in the 9th month of 1867. So almost at the collapse of the Tokugawa regime. And you can see, I won't read all of this, but you can see that the farmers went to various places to get their night soil, mostly in what are now very expensive Tokyo neighborhoods like Aoyama and Azabu and Akasaka, about 4 to 6 miles from Taishido. And some people had lots of sources, other people had just one source, and then some residents didn't have independent sources of night soil at all, and presumably they got it from other farmers in the area. This document is a byproduct of the protests in 1867. So in 1867, villagers from hundreds of villages around Edo complained that the night soil brokers, particularly the men who went in to buy night soil and then resell it outside the city to consumers, farmers that is, mostly in the eastern hinterland of Edo, were jacking up their prices too much. And also they were diluting the night soil with river water to make it more expensive. And the way that they were jacking up their prices was keeping the unit price the same, but then making the units smaller. So they were using smaller barrels than they were supposed to be using. And so the price was going up. And because the prices were going up, the farmers couldn't afford to buy fertilizer. If they couldn't buy fertilizer, they couldn't grow their crops. And if they couldn't grow their crops, they couldn't survive. And this is an outrage, and you must do something about it. Compelling enough, I suppose. What's remarkable to me is that the Tokugawa regime is going to fall. Everybody knows that it's going to fall. The castle is practically on fire, and yet the good bureaucrats of the shogunate took the protests seriously. They issued a series of edicts saying this is an outrage. You must restore prices. You must not engage in nefarious practices like diluting night soil, which weakens its efficacy and makes it more expensive. And they commissioned this survey, not just of Taishido village, but of many villages, in Setagaya for sure, and I suppose elsewhere. And it's also remarkable because in the fall of 1867, the population of Edo was declining pretty rapidly because everyone knew that the regime was about to fall, and the system of alternate attendance had been suspended several years earlier. So actually the number of digestive tracts producing night soil had gone down quite a bit. So it actually figures that the price would go up, supply and demand. But people didn't see it that way, and then the shogunate tried to intervene, apparently with some efficacy. At least the protests didn't survive or didn't continue after the regime fell. So it does show that this hardly brought the Tokugawa regime down, but it does show what a big deal and what an important commodity it was. So you have this wonderful system of urban dwellers producing night soil that they don't want to have in the city, of rural farmers using it to produce vegetables and other things that kept the cities clean and the farmers happy and the cities well supplied with food. A perfect resource cycle, as they say, without much waste ironically, without much waste along the way. And thanks to that, we're told that Edo was as green as they get. And here's a longer version of the quotation that I read in my overture. This is from Tokugawa Tsunenari's The Edo Inheritance. The strong interest in sanitation was a trait shared by the entire population of Tokugawa, Japan. Edo was the cleanest city, and Japan the cleanest nation in the world between 1600 and 1800. Mr. Tokugawa wrote this book talking about the long peace of the Tokugawa period and then the greenness of Tokugawa, Japan as the two reasons why we should all honor and respect the Tokugawa period and his Tokugawa shogunal ancestors. And in fact, Mr. Tokugawa was picking up on a kind of Edo equals eco, that is ecological boom. I don't know if I should throw that word around too much, but a kind of fad for thinking about what a green city Edo was. And this is just 2 minutes of Googling Edo eco in Japanese, and I came up with all these things. Edo wa Nihon sekai saiko no wandaranto, and so on and so forth. So this idea of a kind of neo-Nihonjinron, maybe that Japan was uniquely ecological, uniquely clean because of night soil, basically. And sure enough, I mean, I tell my students with all sincerity that if I had to be reborn someplace in the days before antibiotics, and I had to choose between being reborn in Edo or in New York, I think this is a deliberate exaggeration, but not, in the 1820s, when New York was just the lower part of the island of Manhattan, the horses alone in New York were producing 10,000 tons of excrement every day. That's a lot of horse poop. And then there were pigs, and not to mention all the people. So certainly Edo was, I think, without any question, a more ecological, the environmentally clean and hygienic place than most Western cities at the same time. So, how Japanese is our story so far? Was the excremental economy just a product of happy happenstance? Good water, easy access to the hinterland, lots of people eager to use and able to use fertilizer? Or is there something deeper in the culture that apparently supported Japan's special relationship with excrement? So let's think about the latter possibility a little bit. And here I want to pause to think about the words that we have for poop. As you can see here in English, we have many, many, many words. I looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and they have 50 different words for shit, including thyme, hinder droppings, pilgrim salve, I kind of like that one, fex and siege, and many, many others. And in Japanese, too, there are lots of words as well. Shinyo, funyo, haisetsubutsu, kuso, unchi, unko, ben, fun, and so on and so forth. But the two words that I'd like to focus on in particular are night soil and waste. So night soil is excrement as a commodity distributed from the city to its hinterland as a fertilizer. As a commodity, night soil is definitely an object of utility and hence a thing of value, whereas waste is the opposite of night soil, excrement as a public nuisance or an outright health hazard, unwanted and valueless sewage in urgent need of disposal. So in Japanese, night soil, there are various ways of referring to it. The most common word is, at least in the literature nowadays, is shimogoe. And those of you who know, I think this crowd probably, just about everyone can read the characters. Shimo is lower, and then koe is means to fertilize or to make fat or fecund. And so the word clearly connotes the fertilizing properties of night soil. And then I think, I mean, if there are any native speakers who could correct me, I don't think there's anything quite like waste as a euphemism for excrement in the Japanese language. The closest thing that I could come up with is obutsu, filthy things, but it's not a euphemism in everyday use, and it doesn't quite have the protean reach of waste. Obutsu is usually used in hospitals and not in daily conversation. And so this is something I've already written about a little bit, but it really impressed me reading Nogyo Zensho, an early agronomical text on agricultural techniques by Miyazaki Yasusada. And so there's this quotation in the book that looks like it ought to be read, "Jo no fu wa kuso o shimu koto, kogane o shimu ga gotoshi." That is, the superior farmer values shit as he values gold. And that's the character that's usually read kuso. But Miyazaki Yasusada glosses this character not as kuso, but rather as koe, or fertilizer, throughout the text. He does this very consistently. And so he uses this character when he's talking about fertilizer in general, and not necessarily when he's talking about human excrement or animal excrement. And so instead of the superior farmer values shit as he values gold, a better translation would be the superior farmer values fertilizer as he values gold. That is, if the judicious and proper use of fertilizer will increase the value of your crops and then therefore bring in more income to you. And so there's this idea of koe or kuso being a very capacious category, certainly in that manual, but also in other agronomical texts that I've looked at. The idea is that shit is anything that fattens the land, and all shit, therefore, is good and contributes to the wealth of the land and hence the prosperity of the farmer. And so in a previous work, that's about as far as I got in thinking through this. So I thought triumphantly, yes, there's this unique relationship with the idea of shit as a particular thing of utility that sort of transcends its sort of biological nature. But then when you think about it, the idea that the Japanese in the early modern period, or even in the modern era, had a unique view of excrement as a thing of value and utility is, I'm afraid, I must confess, unsupportable, I think. Farmers in early modern China also said, more or less in the same language, that they should treasure night soil as if it were gold. And then other people treasured night soil as well. And then, in fact, the word night soil, the phrase night soil, its earliest attestation in the Oxford English Dictionary is 1725, and it was so referred to in that way since at least 1725, whereas the use of waste as a euphemism for excrement is first attested only in 1836. I don't know if these philological exercises really say that much, but still people are talking in early modern England about these things, and not necessarily in the way, yucky waste, the way that we might think that they would. So perhaps excrement isn't the answer to the question of a kind of a feudalism, modernization theory, poop. Maybe that won't work after all. Too bad. I dreamed a beautiful dream for a few months there. But I think not all is lost, that we can think about how thinking with excrement can give us a new view of the 19th century in Japan. So, for example, I'll just give you a few examples. Members of the Iwakura Mission visited sewer facilities in Britain and France when they were doing their tour of the Western world in 1873. And they were genuinely impressed, but also kind of puzzled. So, for example, the official record of the mission says that the sewers of Paris constitute one of the most awe-inspiring sights of the city. And then they noted that in Britain, the soil is not fertile and great efforts must be made to promote agriculture, with 20 million tons of guano imported each year from Peru. And so how could it be that all that human waste from the capital is discarded with the evening tide? And then, as you can see from the third quote from the record of the mission, they noted that scientists in Europe were very interested in the way that people in Japan and China, and they often sort of conflated the two, saw that in East Asia, human excrement was used as night soil, as a fertilizer, and they're really interested in that process and finding some way to imitate that and bring it to the cities of Western Europe. But mostly they were just puzzled. You know, why would you throw away all that valuable fertilizer and spend all that money to bring in guano from Latin America? It just seemed like a strange waste of money, waste of resources to them. And sure enough, there were people, as they had noted, that in England and in Germany and even the United States, who were eagerly trying to figure out a way to use night soil's potential. And so the chemist J.L.W. Thudicum in 1863 wrote that each chamber pot was a penny savings bank and other things to try to encourage people to use night soil as a fertilizer. But these projects never worked out very well, despite literally decades of efforts to popularize night soil. This is from an agronomical manual published in Manchester in 1799, so quite a while, 2 or 3 generations before the 1870s, where the key line in Japan and China and Japan were told the laws prohibit the waste or neglect of human excrements. It's not really true. There was no law against wasting poop in Edo, but so far as I know, but certainly the idea that it was a very valuable thing that ought to be emulated was there in the discourse about poop in Western Europe at the time of, during the 19th century. To me, and there's lots of reasons why that I'll talk about in a second about why night soil never really caught on or got a secure place in the agricultural economy of Western Europe and the US. But for me, I like this because it's an example of East Asia being looked to as more advanced than the West at the time, about the same time that folks like the members of the Iwakura Mission were, of course, looking to the West for technology and institutional sort of models of modernity. So that there was a kind of dialogue about being advanced or not advanced, worthy of emulation or not worthy of emulation, that was going back and forth between Asia and the West at this time. The reasons that night soil didn't really catch on, I think, in the West were partly attributable to infrastructural problems, just the way that cities were constructed, and the way that toilets were constructed led to events like the Great Stink of London in 1858, followed later by a Great Stink of Paris. Parliament became literally sort of uninhabitable because the Thames stank so badly, and people were so afraid of getting sick from that bad smell. And then there was cholera, which repeatedly swept through London, killing quite a few people. And so people became afraid of the water, which was filled with sewage from human bodies, so they had good reason. And cholera and the water were connected, obviously, and so people were afraid of shit. In Japan, even though Edo and then Tokyo were swept by several important cholera epidemics, that association between excrement as nights or just human excrement and the spread of cholera was not, it was made by people who were interested in hygiene and public health, but the people who were concerned with the infrastructure of Tokyo and the economy of night soil never seemed to have made that connection. So even within the Tokyo city government, there seemed to have been two viewpoints, but the people interested in economy prevailed, and so there was no attempt to curtail the buying and selling of night soil because of the threat of cholera. And then finally, there's the issue of guano, which the Iwakura Mission folks noted. And from around the middle of the 19th century onward, the availability of cheap and extremely effective guano really made the use of human excrement a non-issue in Western agriculture. That's partly because of just the kinds of crops people were growing, and the fact that guano, which is basically bird poop, sort of fossilized or sort of semi-fossilized or dried bird poop, was extremely potent, lots of nitrogen. So you could get much, much more sort of fertilizing punch from the same volume of guano than you could from night soil. And then things like the invention of the flush toilet pretty much just ended all hope of using human excrement as a fertilizer on a large scale in Western cities. But there were dreamers who were hoping there's still dreamers who are hoping to bring it back. Anyway, so there's a logical history of why night soil didn't really catch on in the West. For me, thinking about this sort of question of the importance of night soil in the Japanese economy and the encounter with Western style modernity is interesting, in part because of the way that a city like Tokyo developed. So when we think about Meiji Tokyo, I think the first thing that at least comes to my mind is the Ginza brick town, and then the creation of the Marunouchi business district, and the gradual sort of introduction of later on of streetcars and railroads and other modern Western style institutions. But there was never any talk of building Western style sewers in Meiji Japan. Not until the 20th century did the first discussions of building underground sanitary sewers begin, because there was no need. There was a good system for getting human waste out of the city and making good use of it, and so there was very little demand, very little call for the introduction of sewers. So the first attempt to build a sanitary sewer came in 1915. The former Mikawashima pumping station, now an important cultural property. You can visit it. It's a bit of a hassle because you have to call and make an appointment, and you can go and tour this facility. It's no longer in use in Arakawa Ward. So with regard to the sanitary sewers, I remember, some of you may remember that many years ago I wrote a rather hostile review of Mikiso Hane's textbook on modern Japanese history. Hostile enough that the journal wanted to clear away the possibility of a libel suit, so I had to tone down the language a little bit. But anyway, one of the things that in that book that irritated me was that Hane, may he rest in peace, pointed out that as evidence of Japan's underdevelopment, that the number of houses in Tokyo that had flush toilets was very low until very recent times. And that was, again, a sign of underdevelopment. But actually, that wasn't a sign of underdevelopment at all. There was no need for sewers, and so people didn't build sewers. If they'd wanted sewers, they could have built them, and eventually they did need them and want them, and so they did build them. Anyway, I guess this has been on my mind more than I realized all these years. So it's like 15 years ago that I wrote that review, and I still can't get it out of my head. So let me just wrap up here. So how green was my night soil in the end? So I think on the one hand, Edo and Tokyo were certainly greener than cities in Europe and the United States at the same time. I think that's an easy call. But Mr. Tokugawa, I think, is certainly wrong when he says the strong interest in sanitation was a trait shared by the entire population of Tokugawa, Japan. The concept of sanitation, per se, had not been invented yet, so I'm pretty sure he's wrong about that. But, so therefore, rather than looking for an essential Japanese sensibility about night soil, let us think with excrement about other features of 19th century Japan, including infrastructure and public health, for starters. And then also, let's use the opportunity to rethink narratives of development and what counted as being advanced or backward. So I don't think that night soil will provide that big meta theory that I had hoped for a little bit, but still there's plenty to think about with and about excrement. So with that, I'll stop and thank you for your kind attention.